in populations of injecting drug users. First, I'd like to acknowledge the colleagues who worked on these studies: Annalie Uskala, Doug Peckathorn, Kamir Aristide, and Mark Kralls. I will briefly go over the RDS methods because Keith did that very well. You do the ethnographic investigation, which can be critical. Select seeds. Each seed can recruit up to 3 subjects. You have successive ways of recruitment, and the subject identification system and coupon management for tracking relationships among the people who are being recruited. The homophily statistic is one of the most interesting data points to come out of an RDS study. The homophily is the likelihood that a subject with a specific characteristic will recruit another subject who has that same characteristic, and this is compared to the distribution of that characteristic in the population. Homophilies are scored on a scale of -1 to 0, 2 plus 1. A 0 indicates no relationship between possessing the characteristic and recruiting another subject with that characteristic. That is, recruitment is essentially independent of the characteristic occurring, and that the characteristic occurs randomly throughout the networks. A +1 indicates a 100% likelihood of recruiting another subject with the same characteristic. That all subjects with the characteristic recruited only subjects who also share the characteristic. And this often occurs with extreme distributions of the characteristic across networks. A homophily of a -1 indicates a 0 likelihood of recruiting another subject with the same characteristic. That none of the subjects who had the characteristic recruited another subject who shared that characteristic. This can occur with extreme distributions of the characteristic across networks, and can be also indicative of issues in recruiting and a possible small number of persons with that characteristic. So that, according to RDS theory, the homophily should give you some important information about the patterns of recruiting. Do likes recruit likes, or do likes recruit difference? We looked at homophilies from 4 different RDS surveys. One conducted in New York City in 2004 on the Lower East Side. At the time, New York had a mature epidemic among injected drug users. The estimated incidence was fairly low, of 1 per 100 person drug users. And this study included also former injectors and people who used drugs but never injected them. In Tallinn, the studies were done in 2005, 7, and 9. At the time, it was an expanding to maybe stabilizing epidemic with estimated incidence of 20 per 100 person years in 05 and 07, falling to 8 per 100 person years at risk in 09. We looked at 2 specific types of homophilies. Homophilies for ethnicity. Do different ethnic groups recruit members of the same ethnic group, or do they recruit members of different ethnic groups? In New York, we had 4 ethnic groups: African Americans, white, Latinos, and other. In Tallinn, there were 2 groups, ethnic Russians and ethnic Estonians. We also looked at homophilies for HIV serostatus, and again, in New York, we had a stable low incidence. In Tallinn, there was high but declining HIV incidence. In New York, when we looked at the HIV homophilies, you'll note that they are relatively high. That for HIV positives recruiting other HIV positives, the homophily was a +0.41. For HIV negatives recruiting other HIV negatives, it was a +0.49. So consistent with the estimated low HIV incidence, we see evidence that people who were HIV positive were recruiting other HIV positives, and people who were HIV negative were recruiting other people who were HIV negative. With respect to the Tallinn studies and Homophilies for HIV status, note that the prevalence was approximately 50% across 3 surveys. The estimated incidence was high in the first 2 surveys and fell in the third survey. The homophily for HIV positives, recruiting other HIV positives, were positive but relatively low. We do see an increase in the homophily for HIV positives, recruiting other HIV positives in the third survey. The homophilies for HIV negatives, recruiting other HIV negatives, were quite low, very close to 0. Both of these indicate considerable mixing and cross-recruiting between HIV positives and negatives, consistent with the relatively high HIV incidence at the time. When we looked at racial ethnic homophilies in New York, we saw relatively high positive HIV homophilies, 0.31 for whites, 0.32 for African Americans, 0.34 for Latinos. The other group was very small, and people with a homophily of minus 1.0, indicating that these others were recruiting only other, did not recruit within their group. The HIV prevalence shows rather marked differences between the ethnic groups. These differences have been stable for about 25 years in New York. And again, the stable differences in the HIV prevalence is consistent with the relatively high positive homophilies for racial ethnic recruiting. In Tallinn, the 2 major ethnic groups are ethnic Russians and ethnic Estonians. In the first 2 surveys, there was a substantial difference in HIV prevalence, with the Russians at 57% and the ethnic Estonians at 38 and 45%. For the third survey, that difference narrowed considerably, 51% for the ethnic Russians and 47% for the ethnic Estonians. You can see that in the first 2 surveys, there were positive homophilies for Russians recruiting other Russians, Estonians recruiting other Estonians. Then in the final survey, where the differences in HIV prevalence dramatically decreased, we see essentially 0 homophily for Russians recruiting other Russians. And for the Estonians, the homophily was a minus 1.0, indicating a relatively small percentage of Estonians in the survey, and that the Estonians recruited only Russians, that the Estonians were clearly socially linked to Russians, and the difference in HIV prevalence was decreasing, consistent with this negative homophily. In terms of conclusions, if the network assumptions for RDS are valid, then homophily should provide epidemiologically useful information. For ethnicity, there was evidence for ethnic segregation in New York, consistent with stable differences in HIV prevalence. In Tallinn, there was evidence for increasing integration of the 2 ethnic groups that was consistent with increasing differences in HIV prevalence. In terms of HIV serostatus homophilies, there was evidence for some serosorting in New York that was associated with stable low incidence. We saw a trend towards greater serosorting in Tallinn associated with a decrease in estimated incidence. Clearly, this is initial work looking at homophilies and what they might tell us with respect to the distribution of HIV in different populations. We need better statistical tools, particularly developing 95% confidence intervals around homophilies. And again, we need data from many, many more sites before we can start using homophilies to give us consistent information about about HIV distributions. But the hemophily is one of the most interesting statistics coming out of RDS sampling, and our initial investigation indicates it may provide very useful information with respect to the distribution of HIV in populations at risk. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Homji Louie, and he is the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine, Department of Epidemiology.